I want to welcome everybody tonight to OPN and any channels that are mirroring us. Thank you. It looks like we're on more channels tonight, so that's great. Um, Glad you all can make it. I think this is going to be an extraordinarily informative evening following on the heels of the last two, so I'm really proud of this and feeling really good about it. Um, I want to welcome all the chatters, and I think we should be right on time here. We're looking at a little bit past 8, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome back, CT, for the third in your trifecta of presentations. We're lucky to have you, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Oh, yeah, you're good. So, and don't forget to wiggle the mouse so we don't get disconnected.
When I do that, when I make that little noise, that means I forgot to wiggle, and I get a message in about 2 seconds.
Yeah, so if we get broken, yeah, Suze, we're ready if you want to throw up the the facilitator stuff. And while Suze is putting that up, I want to remind everybody we do have all of CT's programming information on our Etherpad, which we'll put up for everybody's consumption at the end of the show. It has all the information that we've posted from the last two shows, plus tonight. And tonight we're going to be talking about values-based consensus decision making. And just before we went live, I put on the flow chart that is on the website, so you guys can refer to it if you want while we're having the conversation. And I recommend that because it'll help focus some of the questions. And we will make sure to have a Q&A tonight, even if we run a little bit long. I ask everybody to hold in there because it's going to be a great night. And tweet it out. Get your friends, family, get everybody watching because we're about to learn something, I think. So this is good. This is a well-timed and highly necessary topic tonight. So we're going to launch right into it, CT. I want to first get briefly what the origin of the values-based consensus decision-making program was. How did that come about?
You mean for me or in the world?
Well, both of those are very good. So let's put some historical context and then how you came to work on that.
Right. I certainly make no claim. I don't believe that what I've developed is new under the sun per se. It's a new version of it, maybe. It's modern. But I certainly believe that there's been other models of a similar nature in the world in the past. But for me, it came about as part and parcel of my Food Not Bombs experience. We were a collective. We were 6, 7, 8, 10, 12 people living together in a house, trying to make all of our decisions cooperatively without anybody dominating, no leaders. And so we had to develop structures that would give us sustainability because we were doing a lot of work day in and day out, doing all this food handling. So we started having meetings and we developed this model of decision making, which we learned through the movement of consensus generally, and we took it deeper, you might say. We took it to apply to our lives, not just to a meeting one day a week.
Excellent.
And that's the real sort of transparent origins of how I went deep with it. I didn't fully understand what I had done in that era with Food Not Bombs till years later. And I didn't write the book, my first book, until 87, and the original collective ended in 83, early 83. So you can see how it took many years to germinate and gestate in me. But that was the cauldron where I learned the skills and learned what needed to be in place for a group of people to work together cooperatively.
Okay, good. And I did want to make a point that, I have the Food Not Bombs book in 92, and the flow chart is somewhat different.
Yes.
There's been a little bit of an evolutionary process as you tweaked it, and I'm looking at the one that's on the website was revised on last year in June. So it's a living process, it looks like.
Exactly. And I'm actually fairly proud of the fact that the visual image of the flowchart, what it looks like from a distance, has stayed the same pretty much for 2 decades. Mm-hmm. But the actual words on the page have evolved because I've gotten a deeper and deeper understanding of what it is that I've developed. I'm very clear that I've only actually developed a handful of original ideas, and most of what I teach came from other people or from other times. So, and that's true for any discipline or any body of knowledge. So that I'm very clear of my role in that.
Okay.
But it was very much attached to political activism and trying to live in a different kind of way from the way I was brought up with a group of other friends. And we had to figure out how to do it. There was, as an example, in the early Food Not Bombs Collective, we developed a technique that we called group. And this is also how we knew who was in the group, who was in the core collective, who was the inner core or the honchos, the ones that are always at the center of things.
Mm-hmm.
We wanted that to be transparent. So if you were in the group, if you were in the core group, it meant that you had made a pledge to everybody else in the group that if you called for a group meeting, which meant a meeting about the group, we were going to talk about the inner dynamics of the group as a meeting, any member could call that meeting, group, and it meant that within a reasonable amount of time, 48 hours, the entire group had to meet together, and we couldn't stop that meeting until the entire group had reached consensus.
I actually want to implement that at our workplace. Just in preparation for tonight. I'm all excited. I'm reading this stuff, and then at our workplace today, they had a development meeting, which is in a room adjacent to my little workspace. And it's a conference call. There's a dozen people around the table. There's a dozen or more out there, on the call. And they were doing everything following Robert's Rules of Orders, and there were splits and all that, and the majority rules, the yay and the nay.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at that going, this is messed up, And then after the meeting, I said, hey, I was watching that, and, it was smooth, but it was just like there's always a minority. And I said, so I'm interviewing this fellow tonight. You guys should watch this. It's on consensus-based decision-making. And they were like, what's that? And so it just struck me that it's such an unfamiliar process to so many people, and what a tragedy that is, because I think, like in my workplace, I think they'd really buy into it if they were fluent in the language. So that's just an aside. So I'm really glad we're doing this tonight. All right, so last night we touched on this a good bit. Let's give our good succinct definition of what consensus is, so everybody's on the same page with the definition.
Right, and the most important thing for me is that it's based on the root word consent. It seems pretty obvious to me, but there is argument about that. But for me, it's based upon the root word consent, and in English, the word consent means you can allow something to happen without having to necessarily agree with it. And of course, in voting, when you do the thing you were just talking about, Robert's Rules, it is the point that you're supposed to either agree with it or strongly support it in order to vote for it, and you're lobbying, debating, going back and forth. But in consensus, all you're seeking is people's willingness to say, yeah, I can go along with that. I can consent to it. I don't necessarily have to like it or agree with it. I might have an other reason, like for the best interest of the group, or because I don't really care that much about it, or whatever. You can have your own personal reasons why you might give your consent and not particularly like the decision.
Okay, great. That's a great definition. So we want to make sure everybody understands consent is not unanimous agreement. Consensus is not unanimous agreement. It's consenting to go along with the decision for the greater good of the project or the group trying to accomplish something. Accurate?
Right. And for anybody who might think that the dictionary should hold sway here, and it is true that in many dictionaries the first definition is general or complete agreement, I would like to point out to people that who writes those dictionaries?
Rich old white guys.
Yeah.
They run the world.
I'm convinced that, at least in my world, the word consensus is about consent and not about agreement, fundamentally.
Okay. I have one more overview question before we get into the carrots and onions of the thing.
Okay.
Is the values-based consensus decision-making system, I guess it's okay if I call it a system.
A model, I call it.
A model. Okay, I like that word better. Is it horizontal and is it leaderless?
Yes, yes.
Okay, horizontal and leaderless, which I know you're going to expand on that. So
Yes.
let's get into the nuts and bolts of what it is, how it works functionally, and then we'll use that as the point of departure for the further questions. So you have the floor. Teach us about the model.
Okay. Well, let's just jump right off of that question because you asked if it was horizontal. Well, what exactly does horizontal mean? What is horizontal? Horizontal is a reference to the structure very clearly because you have vertical structure and you have horizontal structure. In a vertical structure, you tend to have this thing we identify as hierarchy, where there are people who are more powerful at the top and people with less power, often doing more work, at the bottom. And one of the fundamental dynamics of that particular structure, a vertical hierarchical structure, is that power and money influence flow upward in that model, and it also concentrates at the top. And we see that dramatically in these economic times fundamentally happening. In a horizontal structure, you do not have that dynamic because it's horizontal. It's this direction. But if you think about buildings, or if you're going to build something, building a vertical structure is kind of straightforward. Stack one thing on top of the next, right? Mm-hmm. But if you're going to build something horizontal, especially if it's going to extend out over, if it's going to cantilever or stretch from shore to shore like a suspension bridge, you've got some serious dynamics you've got to consider in terms of structure to make sure that you can hold the thing up on a horizontal kind of diving board kind of perspective, if you see what I'm saying.
Right.
So when you build a horizontal structure for your group organization, you've got to have some pretty serious structure. You can't just hope it's going to work. Unfortunately, as you just pointed out at the very beginning of the show, many people don't have a clue that there even exists horizontal structure. And then when they find out that it exists, they want to play with it. They think they can just put a board off the edge of the pool and dive off of it, and they walk out, it falls down because they didn't anchor it. They didn't do anything to make it an actual diving board. And what I see all around me in the left and in political groups is people trying to build horizontal structures without any structure.
They have no anchors, yeah.
No anchors, no boundaries, no form, structure and form. So one of the major, probably the major thing that I teach is that there is a structure to horizontal governance. And there is a structure, in fact, there's a stronger structure for horizontal governance and for leaderless governance. It's not a lesser structure, it's a stronger structure. I would argue that in Robert's rules and in voting, you don't need so much structure because you have, it's an easier process to dominate. It's an easier process to have it concentrated in one person. If you're going to try to lay it out across the horizontal, you've got to have some pretty strong support to do that. So what I teach is a model of decision making that is built on a horizontal, built with or builds a horizontal structure within the group, so that all voices may be heard is the cliche that goes with that concept. And so I believe that my model really does create an environment where all voices are meaningfully heard, that matters. When somebody says something in a group of any size, whether it's just two people talking together in dyads, it affects the room, it affects the group, it affects the overall process, and that means their voice was heard, even if their personal voice wasn't heard by the person on the other side of the room. So that's the idea, structure. So that's horizontal.
Okay.
And leaderless, actually, that's a misnomer, not only because it might be more accurate to say leaderful, but really what it misses is that this model requires participation. It's funny to me that we have this language now, direct democracy. I mean, not direct, participatory democracy. It's sort of like direct democracy, participatory democracy, when in my mind, democracy means that's redundant. Mm-hmm. That if the people are not participating, there is not democracy, because democracy is the people making the decisions. However you define the people, but the people making the decisions. And if you're not hearing from them, they're not making the decisions. So participation is what leaderless means. You got to participate. And many people think and participate in groups in a way that allows other people to do the work, for other people to do the heavy lifting of figuring out what to do next, of other people to plan things and make the structure happen, and they just show up and do the work and just show up at the meetings and just sit there and listen. That's not democracy. That's not leaderless. That's people, individual people, defaulting as they've been trained in the overculture to give over their power to the leaders, and they're walking into a leadership situation just defaulting, giving over their power, but there's no leaders to pick up that power, so things get messy. Things don't happen. And that's not okay, because in a democracy or a horizontal structure, you've got to participate. You've got to step up. And that's how it becomes leaderless, not just by not having people dominate or control things. That's the hostility towards facilitators in a meeting because they're acting like leaders is beginner. It's immature. That of course that's what's going on. That's what you're doing on purpose because it's helpful to have somebody lead the meeting in terms of process. You don't want them to lead the meeting in terms of content, but you want them to lead the meeting in terms of process, and that's helpful. So you honor, the group recognize, okay, for this particular meeting, we're going to let Sally be the leader of the meeting of process. She's going to facilitate. We're just going to let her do that, and that's okay because we empowered her. We asked her to do that. She didn't decide for us that she was going to do that. We asked her, she accepted, and now we'll trust her. We'll let her do it, and it will help the meeting. It'll be a better meeting because of that. And then when the meeting's done, we thank her, and that's it. She doesn't get any special rewards. There's nothing, no extra power comes to her because she facilitated that meeting. And in fact, in reality, the way I teach it, less power comes to her because when you're the facilitator of a meeting like that, you don't get to participate in the decision making.
Right. So the facilitator is just steering for process.
Correct.
Okay.
And doing a job that the group asks them to do.
Okay. Great. Can you step us through the process? Like I'm looking through the chart, and again, for anybody who didn't catch it, we do have the flow chart posted
Right, so this
on
flow
the
chart
Etherpad.
people?
Yeah,
You've
yeah.
got this flow chart?
That's the
Okay.
one.
Yeah. Okay. Stepping you through the process. Of course, I teach a 14-hour workshop on that, so this is a very, very cursory or overview of it. And I'm not going to go into all the nuances, of course. But the idea is that, and I just, because I like storytelling, I like to do this in the frame of what actually happened to me. I was a young activist in the 80s, and we were using consensus according to sort of the way the feminists and the Quakers had kind of used it up to that point. And we were having lots of meetings. But we were also doing stuff. It wasn't that we were just having meetings, but we were also having lots of meetings. And I went to a lot of meetings. And I was quite painful because a lot of the meetings were really quite sloppy and really quite ugly in terms of people's egos and battling each other and arguing and people getting mad at each other and stuff like that. So I really studied why that was so, what was going on. And without going into the whole story, I observed that when people immediately respond to what somebody said, so somebody in the group says something, and the overall culture, the structure, the process is that anybody in the group can then immediately respond to them, ask them a question about it, challenge them, ask them to defend it, say something opposite. You know what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of like that debate model.
Right.
And when that happened, almost completely independently of how the second person spoke, whether they were aggressive and mean or whether they were kind and gentle, didn't really matter. The impact it had on the speaker, the first speaker, was significant amount of the time, not all the time and not necessarily the majority of the time, but a significant amount of the time, a process of shutting them down, where I noticed that the rest of the meeting they really didn't participate. That was the end of their participation in the meeting. And since I was sensitive to the idea of democracy being participation, anything that would make people stop participating in the group subsequent to that happening was not something you wanted to have happen. So I chose, one night or something, I had a dream, or I don't know exactly how it happened, but I came up with this idea that we could create a structure that didn't allow people to respond immediately after somebody says something. That there gets to be a process within decision making where people can share what they have to say, And that's it. It's just an idea. They just put it out there on the table, and then we hear the next idea, and then the next idea, and the next idea. And they can be contradictory ideas, and they can be very different ideas. It doesn't matter. It's just all the ideas get dumped out on the table in a safe space where you don't have to defend them, you don't have to explain them, you don't have to agree with them. Again, it's consensus. It's not about agreement.
Right.
So, and this is just the early stages of decision making. So you can just hear it, and then at least you know where everybody's at, even if you totally, quote unquote, totally disagree with them. You're just a safe space to put the ideas out. So I started experimenting with that, and sure enough, it worked really well. So the big picture of the model is that the first two levels, level 1 and level 2, are discussions, what I call discussions, but they're not the typical kind of discussions that we see in most meetings with back and forth, back and forth. They are discussions about certain aspects of decision making where when somebody speaks, it's inappropriate, it's against the rules, it's not the structure of my model for anybody else to then comment on what that person just said. Got that?
Right.
So level 1 is a kind of discussion where there's no crosstalk, where you just get to put your ideas out there, and what you're talking about is what are the values that matter or light up when you hear this proposal. Here's this proposal. So the person wants to do something, or wants the group to do something, or wants to spend some money, or whatever those proposals are. Okay, well, that's the content. But what does it mean to you? Why would this person want to do it? Why would you want to do it or not want to do it? How is it going to affect the overall purpose of the group? And how does it affect so those are all, in my mind, value questions. Mm-hmm. What are the values underlying this proposal? And you talk about that as a group, where everybody gets to put out their idea of what they think this proposal would do for or against the group in terms of values. In terms of values, not in terms of outcome, not in terms of who will do it, just in terms of values. You have that discussion, and really you're trying to answer the question, why should we do this proposal in the first place? How will it support or nurture or move the group forward? Because the group is making a decision, and it seems to me that only those decisions which move the group forward or nurture it or benefit the group are the decisions the group should make, by definition. So, right. So that's the question you're trying to answer, and you're talking about values to do it, and there's no crosstalk, and there's no solving anything. It's a wide open discussion. At the end of it, you have no clarity. You have all this information, and you don't know what you're going to do with it, and that's by design.
And that,
so you're opening up.
Okay, that's level 1. I want to make sure I'm following good. I'm sorry to interrupt.
That's level 1. Okay. Now, level 2 is fairly simple. If you do what I just described, and because I believe conflict is good, that conflict is in the nature of human beings, that we're going to have differing ideas and different ways of seeing things and different things that we want to do, and that's called conflict. And what I teach, and what's in the front of my first book, right? I can even show it because it's big. This is my first book here, and in the front piece, I have this quote. It's very, very important, right? And it says, war and peace, and I should have peace and war. And it says, if war is the violent resolution of conflict, so pause right there. Mm-hmm. War is not conflict. War is violent resolution of conflict. First there was the conflict, and then you had the war to see who wins. Mm-hmm. War itself is not the conflict. Of course, now with the news of endless war, maybe it is. But the original concept of war, I just realized the craziness of that. But the idea was that there was some conflict, usually over natural resources or ideology. And then you went to war to see who would get to prevail. So it's very important to recognize that the modern media and the modern culture is confusing us with the idea that war itself is the conflict, which it is not. And there's this underlying conflict that could be resolved non-violently, because I believe for every conflict, there is a choice between a non-violent resolution and a violent resolution. And it may be hard to see what could be possibly non-violent about the situation, but I believe if you look and study and train hard enough, you can find them. I have a faith in that. So, in level 2, after you've had this conversation about values, it's going to be evident, without anybody saying anything or ever talking about it, that there are conflicts, that people said different things about this very proposal. Sometimes very different understandings of even what it's about, but also different ideas of how it should affect the group and how it should be valued. So you identify those conflicts. It's okay. It's a safe space to say, this is one of the things I will need fixed or changed or altered in order for me to consent to this proposal. So you get an opportunity just to say that. Again, no crosstalk, no need to defend it, no need to explain it. You just get to say, this is one of the concerns that I have in order to adopt this model. So it goes fairly quickly. You just open up the floor. Anybody have concerns they'd like to list so that we know what we need to address before we reach consensus on this. So it's almost like a brainstorm even. Where you just kind of put out ideas. But already that's very, very different.
Right. Can I want to summarize so we don't lose track here. So level 1 is everybody's putting out their ideas and values.
Yep.
Level 2 is people are listing their concerns. So it's in my brain, it's like an outline. And at neither of those points is there crosstalk by the model.
Correct.
So you get to say your part, I get to say my part. We may be at opposite extremes and disagree vehemently, but we're not having the debate or the crosstalk. We're just saying we all agree that we're going to put our ideas out, and then we're going to put our concerns out. So that's level 1 and 2. Okay?
Right.
I know I'm over.
Yeah.
I know I'm oversimplifying, but it's because we don't have 14 hours, right? Okay, continue, please. So we got our concerns out there. Now what?
So then in level 3 is when you begin the process of what might be called crosstalk, although it looks very different. But it is the dynamic of a particular concern or maybe a set of concerns being addressed, being focused on. The facilitator says, okay, look at this concern. This looks pretty important. Let's take this on. So they allow the person who had the concern now to present it again, be more clear about it, give a little more information about it. There can be clarifying questions from the floor to make sure everybody understands what's being talked about. And then there's an open process, and it's very similar to the back and forth that we're familiar with in meetings, with one major difference. But this is a huge difference. In the old model, when we're debating ideas, what we're trying to do, the goal in most discourse, is to get the other person to understand my point of view. I'm trying to explain myself or argue the veracity or the correctness of my position. And in this model, not only are you primarily focused on trying to understand what the other person is trying to say, because you need to understand the group's will, because everybody's committed to doing what's best for the group, which includes everybody in the group. So you as an individual need to have a pretty good grasp of what you believe everybody else in the group thinks, so you know that the decision is in the best interest of the group and not just one person's. So you really, again, participation is so important. You really have to have high confidence around the circle that people are actually sharing what they think so that they really are buying in. So you want to hear from people. Your objective in level 3 is to make sure that you've heard from every person and they really are understanding and cooperating with the decision, that they're seeing that it's truly in the best interest of the group. And to accomplish that, what that looks like is that you can imagine that the proposal is a lump of clay out in front on the table, out in front of everybody. And when somebody has a concern and somebody wants to try to resolve that concern by changing the proposal, they can just reach out to that lump of clay and change a part of it and add an arm or twist it this way or that way. And they go, there, that's my resolution to the lump of clay. And then the next person that speaks just sort of reaches out and says, and pats that part back down, but adds this part over here. And says, no, that's what I say. And everybody looks at that and says, oh, well, but how about this over here? And everybody gets to just kind of reach in there and change that lump of clay according to their vision. And you just kind of do that fluidly without arguing about who's right or wrong about it. Because the next person can go right back in and just change it back the way it was.
So level 3, everybody gets to adapt and adjust. Everybody gets equal opportunity to do that. Has there been any crosstalk in that
No, at this point there is crosstalk. At this point you can ask questions. You can say, I don't really understand what you mean by that. And say, well, what have you considered this idea? And where did you get that information? And, why are you really saying this? Those things would be, I mean, not accusatory, but like, I want to understand. Again,
Right.
from the spirit of, I really want to understand where you're coming from.
Gathering
Because
whole information.
Right.
Yep.
So it's a very open environment to really work together, because the other concept, which is all the same concept, is that everybody in the group wants to resolve every concern for the best interest of the group, because somebody in the concern group has the concern. So, and as soon as somebody articulates, then it becomes the group's concern, not the individual's concern, because there might be other people who haven't said anything yet who feel the same way. Plus the fact that if you can resolve a concern in the best interest of the group, that's better for the group. Why not? Everybody tries to resolve a concern. It's not okay to say, oh, that's not my concern, I don't have to deal with it. Participation is important. So that's level 3. And basically, when you go through, and what happens is sometimes in level 3, you realize you didn't do your homework. You realize you didn't do a good level 1 or level 2.
Right.
And sometimes you have to go back up the ladder. And some of my students like a version of the flowchart that's horizontal, that goes across the page horizontally rather than top to bottom. I certainly appreciate the spirit of that, but for me, this is just a flowchart. It's a systems chart. It doesn't have anything to do with hierarchy or structure. It's the flow that the decision goes through, and you can't actually, on paper in 2 dimensions, show the real flow of a decision, because it's more like a spiral. Or sometimes it goes back, it hiccups and goes back up to the top again. So it's got all kinds of internal dynamics that are not on that piece of paper.
That word spiral is going to haunt you in about a half an hour, because I'm going to roll it into one of my questions. But
Okay.
I want to interrupt. So I'm just looking at the chart, and there was a note for test of consensus after level 1, and assuming that's too early in the process generally, then we go to the concerns and everything, and then there's a note for a test and consensus after level 3 conversations and adjustments have been made.
Yes.
And so at those points, once the conversation for that particular level have happened, then we just open it up and just do, like, for in Occupy terms, the temp check to see where we are on that, or what? How does that work when you say test?
Well, no,
it's
very, very different.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Good.
Consensus is very different.
Now we're getting down to the meat of it.
Yeah.
Or the
right.
carrots of it.
The tofu.
Yeah, the tofu.
The tofu of it. In fact, in my opinion, and I've been familiar with hand signals for 30 years. They're not new. The unique ones. I mean, the twinkles is actually, as far as I know, American Sign Language for applause. The up twinkles. But it used to be in the old days, it was thumbs up, thumbs sideways, and thumbs down. That was the image. That's been around since before me, and that's 30 years ago. So hand signals are not new, but in my opinion, all hand signals pretty much, except for like raising your hand to be recognized or asking a clarifying question. I think a hand signal for clarifying question makes a lot of sense, because that should be prioritized if it's a true clarifying question. In my mind, in my process. So there are a couple of hand signals that are legitimate, generally speaking, but when the temperature check, that concept, temp checks and doing the twinkles, how many people like it, that's a popularity test, or otherwise known as voting.
Right.
And so that's a form of voting, and I'm not too keen on it. In my model, when there's a test for consensus, it means something very specific. It's a particular question, and the question is always framed in the opposite or in the negative. So when somebody says, I think we should go see the Iron Man 3 or whatever's in the movies right now tonight, if they say, who wants to go, that doesn't produce an outcome. But if they say, who does not want to go, you immediately get down to what you need to talk about. That's just with a group of friends in a very informal way. It produces a true test for consensus.
Okay.
Because what you want to hear from is what you want in consensus. It's not an accident. What you want in consensus is silence. Silence is consent. That's a double-edged sword. It can be a positive statement. It can be a negative statement. But if you're not participating, if you're caving, if you're acquiescing, it's a very negative thing. But if you're empowered and you know what you're doing and you're actively remaining silent because you have consent, then when you test for consensus, what you want is silence.
Oh, I love that.
So if you ask who likes this, you're not going to get silence. You're going to get a bunch of nodding heads. Yeah, let's do it. But of course, there might be the 3 people out of 20 that are thinking this is terrible. Ugh. But then they see that 17 people want to do it and they don't say anything. And
right.
The group does something stupid. The group lynches somebody. Does some character assassination, something stupid. But if you ask who doesn't want to do this, you're immediately speaking in the old parlance to the minority. Because you wouldn't even ask who doesn't want to do this if you didn't think at least some people wanted to do it.
Right. So you're opening that door for them, for their voices to be heard.
Correct. So you have to ask the negative question. Who doesn't like this? Who doesn't want this? Who has concerns? So in my parlance, the technical question is, I'm drawing a blank. Are there any remaining concerns, are there any remaining unresolved concerns that need to be resolved in order for you to give your consent?
And if you get silence, you know where you are. And if somebody has a response, then you know where you are.
Right.
Okay.
And
good.
it could be more simplified by saying any unresolved concerns, and even more simple, it could be any objections. Those are the phrases to test for consensus. You create a silence, and you wait to hear the voice of the people who do not want to do it, because you want group buy-in.
That alone is worth all the effort we've put in to do this interviews, because it's a different manner of operating. Just that particular part alone, to ask the negative question, because nobody wants to ask a negative question, but the negative question with the acclamation of it being silence is just brilliant, because then there's just no doubt in anybody's mind. You open a door for a safe place for somebody to speak up. If nobody speaks up, then you know where you stand. So, okay, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm very excited about this.
Great. And again, that's not one of the things I invented. I learned from other people, and I just deeply understand it, and I applied it to my model. And so I teach it, but I'm not claiming to have invented that concept per se. Although the separation of the introduction of the structure of no crosstalk for level 1 and level 2, that's my innovation. That's one of the things I developed. And I'm willing to own it. Some people like it, some people hate it. That's okay. It's a model. It's a particular model of what I think actually is consensus, but I've started using the language value-based consensus to distinguish it from the more popular unstructured consensus.
Right. Okay. And then moving on at level 3, so we ask the negative question. We either get the response, which then we talk about more. We address that, and we're working towards common resolution on that. If we get to the silence part, then we know we have tested for consensus and effectively reached it, yes?
Correct. And at that moment, I encourage groups to develop a ritual that they do to honor the fact they just made a decision. So immediately after the silence, something else can happen. But the goal is to get the silence. Yes.
Okay. So that is I know there's a lot more detail to it, and a lot
One more.
Okay, go ahead.
There's the 3 closing options.
Okay.
Okay, on the chart. That's important.
Right.
Okay. Because people all the time ask about this, so it's really important to just mention it, because I have a unique or different way. It's one of the things I also developed. That's the other thing that I developed is in that area. So if it's a concern that comes up after testing for consensus and the group still has the patience and tolerance for more time, either at that meeting or a subsequent meeting, like maybe the decision doesn't have to be made tonight, it can be put off for another meeting, you might do what's called send to committee. Sometimes it's called tabling. It's basically putting it off to the next meeting or to another time and allowing work to be done on it in between.
Okay.
So when you test for consensus and you don't get silence, when you get concerns, that's one option. That's one way to deal with it and move on with the meeting. Okay? The second option, this is where it becomes very important, is that you can do this thing called stand aside. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of this concept. And I've codified it to make it really clear what I mean and how it works in this model. And that is that you've had an attempt for everybody in the group to get a chance at resolving the concern. Okay? And the person or people who have the concern respond back, nah, that didn't work for me. I still have the concern. I'm still upset. I still need this concern to be resolved more. And the group feels frustrated. So, well, we tried to resolve it, and you're not getting it. You're not cooperating. You're not going with us. At that moment, and only at that moment, it would be appropriate for the facilitator to ask the individual or the subset, the people who are still concerned, would you be willing to voluntarily, cooperatively, stand aside on your concern, allow us to reach consensus, meaning you're giving your consent, and because you're giving us your consent, we will include your disagreement, your concern, in with the decision. So that when it gets written into the notes tonight, we decided A, B, and C with this concern, X, Y, Z, unresolved. Meaning it's still an open topic.
Right.
But it does also mean you give your consent and the proposal is adopted. It's passed. That's a unique feature of consensus that doesn't exist in voting.
Right.
You get to stand aside. And there are all kinds of reasons why people might do that. It's a very politically powerful thing to do. But sometimes, whatever it is that your concern is so egregious and you're so upset about it that you feel you need to say, I cannot do this. I cannot go along with this, and I cannot stand aside. And here it's commonly referred to as the block. It's something that I feel is hugely misunderstood. People hear people say, oh, really blocks should only happen once in a lifetime or once, a decade or once a year or something like that. And I agree with that spirit of that. But the reason is because I teach individuals do not block the group. Individuals withhold their consent. They say, I cannot consent to this. That's what individuals do. And then in that moment, and only in that moment, so they've already denied or put down or said no to stand aside. They were given the option to stand aside. They chose not to stand aside, but to continue to withhold their consent, continue to have the concern, and not go along with the group, the prevailing proposal, whatever it is. And the facilitator turns to the group and says, are we blocked? And it's a group decision whether they're blocked or not. And what that means to me is, and this is where value-based becomes so important, and understanding value-based, and we don't have the time to do this tonight, but this is the point, is that if the person who's withholding their consent, that person or group of people, if the reasons why they say they are doing it as members of the group, because they are members of the group, is because of values and purposes that everybody has consented to. In other words, they're pointing to the things that everybody in the room and say, yes, we consent to that. These are our common values. These are our common purposes. And we've already made those decisions before. And the people tonight are saying, because of those reasons is why I'm blocking, why I'm withholding my consent. Then the group should definitely take that very, very seriously and probably block themselves. Say, we cannot move forward without further investigation into this issue, and refuse to move forward without that person. But the group can also choose to say, we've tried to deal with your concerns. We've done everything we can to meet your needs. It's greater than we can do. We still want to do what we want to do anyway, so we're going to do it.
We're going to do it.
Yeah. They can override the block of the individual. They can ignore the withholding of consent, which in essence puts that person outside the group.
Right. Okay.
They're no longer in the group. It doesn't kick them out, but it says, you don't get it. We're really going to do this thing. This is what we're about. This is why we came together. And just because you don't want us to do it doesn't mean we're not going to do it. There's a whole lot of people that don't want us to do it, but we're going to do it because we believe in it. That's why we came together.
And
That's our purpose of our group.
It's a collective group decision.
Correct. It's based upon, so, again, if the person is withholding their consent for a reason that they point to that says it's one of those collective reasons, the collective should pause to consider that. But if it's something personal, something that they feel that, it might be their personal value, it might be very strongly held personal value, they're just in the wrong group.
a good point. I want to remind everybody. This is an example of what Akine talked about a couple of weeks ago about we want to welcome everybody to the table, but sometimes it's not the right table for them. It's not a
Right.
personal issue. It's just the wrong table for them. So this falls right in line with that. So um, once we do
That's it.
the closing options, then that would be at the point that it would move for implementation, whatever decision was made, or
Right.
so very important that we get the consensus, then we move to implementation, right? So,
Right.
okay,
And one of the advantages of consensus is that implementation happens very quickly.
because all the grunt work was done on the front end of it
Correct. You
instead
don't have
of
any.
as you're trying to implement.
Well, because what happens in many groups, we use voting, especially have minorities, is the people who end up in the minority on the vote and are grumping. They drag their feet, they sabotage, they grump about it, they don't show up. They do all kinds of negative things because they didn't want to do it,
Right,
and they were forced to do it because the majority said we're just going to do it anyway.
right.
So you have also, and never mind the lack of communication and confusion and all the other things that happen. So in a consensus model, theoretically at least, everybody at the point of being silent when they reach their consent, they know exactly what happens next. Everybody knows exactly what happens next.
Right. Implementation. Bada boom.
Right.
Okay. I want to summarize, and you correct me if I'm wrong, because now I want to start questioning, the model. Okay.
Sure.
So, and I'm looking at all my notes. So, level one is open sharing of ideas and values. We all bring our ideas after the proposal. You know, I want to paint the house red. Everybody brings their ideas and values about painting the house red to the table. Level two is we all independently bring our concerns about painting the house red to the table. There's no cross discussion in either one of those levels. Number three, we work to determine what shade of red we want, what brush we're going to use, and all that. Everybody's contributing. This is the point at which crosstalk and problem resolution takes place.
Yep.
Um, After we resolve all that, we test for consensus by asking the negative question, which is, does anybody not want to paint the house red? Or
Okay.
whatever we taupe or whatever we agree to, right? The negative question. If we get feedback, then we roll back in and we work on resolving those questions, those feedbacks. If we're successful, we ask the negative question again. We get silence. We have consensus. And when does it go to the closing options?
Well, no,
Before?
that's above the closing options is arriving at consensus.
Got
That's
it.
that's the output.
Okay, so if we
So if you're
don't,
done,
yeah, if we don't, so we're
closing
done
options.
then. But
No.
if we have closing options, we can table it to revisit,
Right.
or we can test for stand aside, like, are you willing to stand aside and allow us to paint this house purple? And I will say, yes, I am willing to do that. I disagree with it, and here's why, but I'm willing to let it happen. I consent to letting it happen. Then we're good to go. Or I just say, absolutely no way, no how, and I can't, because of my value system that we've all agreed to as guidance, I can't do this. And then the group says, are we blocked? The group says, are we blocked, or do we need to move forward? Do I have it
Okay.
sort of? I mean,
Yeah.
that's a
You're
really
close.
broad brush.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
and I want to make sure, are the chatters following that? Are we all on the same page? Because I'm going to ask questions based on this model. So unless somebody interrupts me really quick, we're off to the races. Make sure X gets the flow chart since he's, okay, Susie's answering for the group and says everybody's good to go. Specific roles necessary to engage in this. From what I'm hearing, pretty much all we need is a facilitator to maintain process. What other roles need to be filled?
Okay, so in the first book, there's I think 8 roles.
Okay, that's
Okay,
not the
so,
food
so
not pump. Okay, 8 roles.
right, and then in the new book, which isn't really a book yet, but it's kind of in the book, it's called Consensus for Cities.
Mm-hmm.
There's 22 roles. So I guess the answer is no. Actually, there's a whole bunch of roles, but it is the case that I kind of teach it as, and I sort of say that each of the other roles are a subset of facilitation. But
Right.
all of them come under the rubric or heading of facilitation, and it's just in a big meeting, it's a lot for one person to do, so you break up in a bunch of different people.
Okay.
So in a certain way, yes, it's like one role is the facilitator, but the facilitator has all these different shades. Like the timekeeper is facilitating the time.
Right.
And the note taker is facilitating the notes, the archives, the record keeping. But then there's also the person called the public scribe who writes things up in front of everybody up on the whiteboard or up on the computer that's projected or however you do it with your group, or uses paper and pen if that's the old-fashioned way.
Right.
And often those notes kind of disappear ultimately. Once the decision is made, they kind of maybe they get put in the archives. Most of them usually get thrown away. But the notes that the other person's taking get put into the archives and are kept for posterity. So there's a very difference. Even though they're similar, the public scribe and the note taker, they're two very different roles, actually.
Okay.
So that's a couple. My favorite, and one of the most important ones that groups almost universally overlook, is the doorkeeper or greeter. And it's partly because it's, to be strong about it, my opinion, the failure to recognize that one of the key things that structure does for a group process is create a safe container, create a strong container, can hold it up, can
Right.
hold it together. And one of the components of creating a safe container is your gate, is your doorway, how you let people in and out. Because whether you pay attention to that or not in the human condition, it matters. So how people come and go from the meeting matters. And when you have a porous perimeter where anybody can just walk in and walk out at any given point in time, that affects the overall quality of the meeting just as much as how well the facilitator is doing or anything else. It's a major component of what's going on in the room or lack of room.
Okay, can I interrupt right there? Because there would be, I can hear the voices of the universe bringing up the inclusion thing. And if
Right.
I understand you right, there's a doorkeeper, and so the doorkeeper's purpose, say it clearly so we can all understand, because it sounds like
Well,
there's an element of exclusion there, which I'm not critical of. I'm just wanting to
no,
make
it's
sure
fair.
I understand.
I thought that was already understood, so let's go back.
Okay.
You were actually some other speaker and talking about the fact that sometimes it's not that person's table. Well, in the spirit of that concept, but to say it a whole other way, it's first of all, this amazes me, but my understanding of the word group is by definition exclusory. Group itself, the concept of group, is exclusory by the way you just used the word exclusory.
I can buy
Because
into
not
that.
every group, I mean, there is one group that is not, and that's the group of everybody. Okay, that's only one group. There's billions of groups in the world. Human beings make groups all the time.
Right, right.
More than one per person, right? So there's billions of groups in the world, literally billions of groups, only one of which includes the group of everybody. All those other groups are a subset of everybody, which means it excludes somebody.
I'm with you. I
Right?
follow. Yeah, I follow.
So that to me is obvious. So when you say you have a group, and we're talking tonight about a group decision-making process. So you've already said group in what we're talking about, the group decision-making process. We're not talking about a decision-making process for fish, which would be fascinating. We could. Fish that swim in schools, and they all move exactly the same way all at once. And how they do that, some sort of subsonic, we don't know exactly how. Fascinating. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about human beings who get into groups, and by definition, that excludes somebody. But it doesn't really exclude somebody because it's not their group. In fact, that's a really misunderstanding of freedom. Because I get to decide what groups I'm in. The group doesn't get to decide.
Right.
I get to decide. And if I'm not in the group because I chose different attitudes and different perspectives, that's not the group excluding me. The group can't exclude me. I decide what group I'm in. So these anarchists who think that the group has to decide who's in the group and who's not don't fundamentally understand freedom.
Good point.
So this is a huge point. Huge point.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Because you hear so much about inclusion, exclusion, blah, blah, blah. And I wrestle with that for the very reason you say. If you create a group, even if you say anybody's welcome, people choose by their behavior, their attitudes, their activities, just any number of things, whether to be part of that group.
Right. So I teach. I have to do this because I know Ren is sitting in the other room going, "Go ahead, CT, do it, do it."
Oh, she's got your back, man. She's clarifying as we go along.
Okay. Good. Well, the example that I use in all my workshops is that if you want to form a group of people who love to bowl, bowling, 10 pins or whatever, love to bowl. So you're going to get a group of people that love to bowl. There's all kinds of groups that love to bowl, right? And there's a whole lot of people who don't go to those groups because they don't like to bowl. Nobody's saying, I'm being excluded, I'm being excluded. They don't want to bowl. The people who want to bowl get together. But your group not only likes to bowl, but they like to bowl at midnight. Well, that's different. So that's going to be unusual, right? There's going to be some bowling lanes that will go along with that. But not only that, your group is really out there. They like to bowl at midnight in the nude. Okay? Now, why can't they? If the bowling alley is willing to let them and they want to do that, that should be allowed, right? And a group of people that want to get together and bowl at midnight in the nude should be allowed to do that, I think. But not everybody's going to. But there might be people out there who think, oh, that's horrible. And they might try to join that group and say, you really shouldn't be bowling at midnight in the nude. You really should be bowling at noon with clown costumes on. And the polite thing to do is say to that person, what a great idea. You go form your own group that bowls in clown costumes at noon, and we'll form a league that we bowl together with costumes on. We'll put costumes on or something, whatever, and we'll do that at another time. But you're not in our group. You're not doing what we're doing. And they shouldn't be allowed, that individual shouldn't be able to come into the group and say, you can't do what you want to do because I don't want you to.
There you go. Yeah. I love
that group came together to do what they want to do. There's nothing wrong. Now, of course, if they said only white people can do that, that would be an injustice based on an other reason.
Right.
The reason is because we don't control our skin color. And it's not fair to judge somebody based upon their skin color.
Right.
And that's a different human value.
Right.
But in terms of things that are arbitrary, like bowling and being nude and doing it at midnight, so whatever you want, form your own group. Another aspect of freedom is the freedom to be able to form your own groups. Free association. That's what that means in the Bill of Rights. Free association is the right to form your own group, not to join somebody else's group and dominate it.
We're getting to an important point, and I love that example. That was absolutely. It's going to be burned into my brain. So the nude bowling and the clowns is crazy. So is the model scalable? Like I can see how it can work in a group of 10.
Okay.
Will it work for a group of 100 or 1,000 or And I've read the notes, but I want you to speak to that.
Right.
I know the number.
Title of this book.
Yeah.
Right.
For whole cities.
The title of this book originally was Cities of 100,000.
Exactly.
But I realized cities are big enough. It doesn't matter how big. It's big. So yes, it's scalable. I don't think there's in the appendix to that book, I have the model for global consensus. So I don't think there's any limit other than the number of people who participate.
Right.
There's a finite number of people.
Well, and that comes back to also, I think, we were just talking about groups. So if groups of 10 work on consensus models, then by definition, those 10 groups could work with 10 more groups on consensus models, so it seems that it is scalable. So yes. It is scalable.
Yes. I did want to get back to the doorkeeper, though.
Okay. Oh, yes, please do. I'm sorry. I took us off into the weeds, but Okay, go ahead.
No, no, no. Well, no, no. The very, very fundamental concept of inclusion and exclusion and how confused people are about that. So the whole idea of it being a group is that the group has a purpose. Every group has a purpose. That's the definition of group two. That's how you know who's in the group and who's not, is what the purpose of the group is. Groups have multiple purposes, but they have a purpose. And that's what drives the group. But when people show up and they're a group, then there's also common values. And they're already there. When the people show up, the common values are already in the room. All you have to do is identify them. And that's a cornerstone, a fundamental aspect of value-based consensus. That's your value base.
Okay.
And the doorkeeper is the person who is saying, as people arrive, either you are a member, and a member means you subscribe to the common purpose and the common values of the group. That is what a member is. And the doorkeeper makes sure that the people who are in the meeting, the people who make decisions for the group, are members. Because that's who you want to be there. You don't want people who want to sabotage your group there. You don't want people who are spying on your group to be there. Of course, they'll show up anyway, but you want to have this idea that the people who are making the decision and everybody in the room should know that everybody in the room is a member. And if you're talking about a group of 20 or 10, everybody can know each other by face. But if you're talking about a group of 100 or 200, you don't necessarily know everybody who's in the room, and yet you want to be sure that everybody's a member, because they're the only people who should be participating and making a decision about this particular group's plans. Now, again, I'm using the word concept of group. If you don't want to be a group, then this isn't relevant to you. You do something else. This is not that. This is for groups. So the doorkeeper both makes sure that the people in the room are members, and of course, most groups have a policy of how to have observers, guests, dignitaries, other people be in the room too. Mm-hmm. It's only special meetings where only members can be in the room, but there are those meetings as well, and most all groups have them. But more importantly, the doorkeeper is an opportunity of the individual in the community to build an aspect of the community, if in no other way than to present themselves. Here they are, the person, they're there in the front of the meeting, they're greeting everybody else in the group as they arrive before the meeting starts, and they get to sort of say, this is who I am. They can sing a little song, they can play a little musical thing, they can read a poem, they can wear a costume, they can do whatever they want to be themselves, but by doing that, build community.
Right.
So that, and because the role rotates, everybody gets a chance to do that. As time goes by, we get to understand each other, know each other better.
And so I think it's safe to assume that the doorkeeper is an important position. So who is making sure that's all handled honestly and ethically? That's the job of the group, correct?
Correct.
Because we don't want somebody at the door with a power trip just trying to control the agenda and all that. So it's a group dealio, right?
Right, and so it's really important. This is my answer to that. What's really important about what you just said. Do you know about the attempted coup in Venezuela that happened a couple of years ago by the CIA, where they kidnapped Hugo Chavez and almost killed him?
Right.
But then he returned to power. You know that story?
Right.
There's a great video called "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised" by a German film crew. Just happened to be there when it happened, and they filmed it. And one of the major points in that video that I think is very, very profound was that what actually happened was that the CIA had a plot to have the military move in and take over and arrest Chavez and deport him, which is what they did, and tell the public that he was acting extra legally, outside the Constitution, and the military had to reassert its power to restate, because he was becoming a dictator, they were saying, and he was outside the Constitution. They needed to bring the Constitution back, and the military had to do that. Mm-hmm. And that's what they got on TV and said. And when they said that, over 2 million people in Caracas went out into the street and shut the city down for as long as they had to until they got Chavez back. And their chant was, give us our Constitution, give us our president. Give us our Constitution, give us our president. The reason why that happened was because the big deal, and the reason why that film crew was in Venezuela filming what Chavez was doing as socialist, was that since he had been democratically elected about 2.5 years prior to this moment, or something like that, a year and a half, he had done a literacy campaign. And the literacy rate in Venezuela went from like 80% to 40%, or don't quote me, but something like that, a la Cuba. Okay, he was following those methodologies. And what they used to teach literacy in Venezuela was the Constitution of Venezuela. So something like 3.5 million people in Venezuela were taught what the Constitution actually said. So when the military junta took over and quoted the Constitution, claimed it said this other thing, the people knew they were lying. And they actually got their president back.
Because they held them accountable, because they knew what the rules,
what the process was.
The process was.
They knew what the rules were. Right.
Yeah.
They knew what the deal was.
So they kept the gatekeepers honest.
Right. Exactly.
Excellent.
If everybody in the room knows what the deal is, then it's very hard for one person to dominate.
That's a great story. And Sue's just put up the video from the Revolution Will Not Be Televised.
Right.
She had a
awesome
link.
Video.
Yeah,
awesome video. Blows your mind.
Yep.
It shows how they use propaganda to take a video clip, and they showed it on TV, and it made it look like the crowd was going wild and shooting and being violent. And then the German company, they take the exact same shot, virtually almost the exact same angle, but they back it out so you see what's really going on, and you see that there are paramilitary types, probably CIA agents or military, shooting into the crowd, and it's people in the crowd who happen to have guns shooting back defensively. But the way they put it on TV, it made it look like the crowd was just attacking people.
Yeah. Which is,
anyway.
No, I just want to jump all over that, because this is why it is so important that we control our own narrative, because there's so many ways to spin things out there, and we have to control our narrative. I just have to throw that out there. So I'm going to take just one brief moment, and I'm going to apologize to the OPN production crew, because I'm about to lob a question out here that is undoubtedly going to result in some people somewhere not being happy. And I want everybody to know that this is my question, and nobody should blame anybody on the production crew. This is my observation and my question. So I'm just putting that out there, okay? And I mean this in the most positive manner. That being said, we have all, over the past year, witnessed untold amounts of GA meltdowns all over the United States, small and large, groups that profess to follow the consensus model that completely go to pieces, very often at the point of blocking, listening to you describe the model. At all points, there's cross dialogue, shouting, and no matter how hard facilitators try to control it, the damn hand signals are just to irritate me, because there's all this stuff going on. There's a lot of distraction. Right. So my question is, what do you see, if you're comfortable answering this, because I want to learn from this, because I believe in it, and I believe there's a workable solution here. But what do you think the causes of the frequent breakdowns? And I speak, having been to Asheville a few weeks ago, I was in a room of 60 people. The number one discussion was the failure of the GA process throughout the country. And this was people from all over the country, including people who had been in Zuccotti in the early days. And everybody agreed, yeah, this is just not working. We don't know why it's not working, but it undoubtedly fails. So what do you think several of the root causes are with that? And then I want to get into, how does the model address deliberate efforts to derail the process? Because it happens frequently, and it happens deliberately. So there I am, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, I want to go on record, and Randall back me up on this, that I knew Occupy and the GA was fundamentally flawed and would not. It was a fundamentally flawed structure, and it would not stand. You could look at me like a structural engineer, And I looked at the structure and said, this will not hold up. This will not be able to sustain what they're trying to use it for, and it will collapse. I said that before I ever attended any Occupy at all in maybe October 4th, when I was first hearing the reports, not, of course, through the mainstream media, but through my contacts of what was going on in New York City. So I immediately knew. So my first Occupy was my local city, Baltimore. I went to their GA on October 7th. It was their 4th GA ever, and they were already melting down. They were already terrified by the meeting that night because they didn't know how to facilitate it. And they were so happy when I showed up because I actually had a clue. But I'm saying that not to promote my ego, but to say I am very clear. I know exactly why the GAs across the country failed. I observed many of them directly myself and observed the very things that I know to be true happening. I could enumerate them, but I don't know there's so much value in that. Maybe the only thing I need to say is that the fundamental unwillingness of many of the young activists, the people who are new to activism, who showed up in the various squares, especially in OWS, but all over the country, and they had this idea. I have suspicions about where this idea came from, but they had this idea that you could not define the group, you could not have boundaries, you could not have rules, you could not have structure, you could not hold people accountable, and what freedom means is that everybody gets to do whatever they want to do. And in that environment, independent of the structure, you're not going to have a very productive meeting. Those are not viable meeting rules. They are rules, but they're the absence of rules, the absence of structure. Okay. And you get what you create. So it's no surprise to me. The question you really asked at the end, it seemed to me, was, the big problem in most everywhere was that people showed up who clearly wanted to disrupt, who wanted to get their personal needs met, mostly just attention and notoriety, by using the GA as a platform for attention. And there was no ability, no structure, no technique, no culture, nothing that would say that should not happen. And in fact, there was a cultural set of mores that said that's exactly what we want to have happen, even though they didn't like the output, which was shouting and disruption of the meeting. So, and as an aside, just because it became so prevalent and so common that at a process I was engaged in Occupy Philly with their dying GA towards the end of April, May, was that there was a series of meetings that I attended. We were trying to propose an other way as possible, one of our slogans, talk about value-based consensus and see if they would consider looking at it and adopting it. And there was so much hostility in the room and so much anger that people started shouting. We weren't directly considering value-based consensus. I never got to propose it. They wouldn't even let me speak. But that was what I was there for, was to make that proposal. They were just arguing about whether or not they should even consider continuing the GAs or whether they should absolutely just kill them and not even try to continue it. That was what the argument was about, and it got into shouting. And I suggested, I created an environment where the facilitator, who was one of my students, got the idea. And so she did this beautiful thing where she said, okay, because at that point when she did this, there was at least 2, maybe 3 people shouting. And she just said, okay, everybody start shouting. Everybody shout. And so everybody started shouting, and within 30 seconds, she had the room back under control. It was great. Because people started shouting, and they realized how stupid it was.
Yeah.
You can't sustain it very long. It's just really dumb. But anyway, so I'm very familiar with that in Occupy. Saw it many, many times. Saw it in Wall Street. Saw it all over the country. How you deal with disruptors and people that are outside the paradigm of what you're trying to do? Well, obviously, if you understand inclusivity and exclusivity when it comes to the concept of group, mm-hmm. and when you say we have a group, that by definition means, if you're going to use the word this way, you're excluding somebody. Because not everybody's in your group. Only some people come to the table. Only some people it's the right table for. So once you defined your group, then the only people in the room should be people that are in your group. And there were people, and I just heard on your program, I guess an archive, where some activist was talking about how one of the reasons why Occupy failed was because the homeless people showed up. And that infuriated me. That was so wrong to make that statement. Because homeless people are homeless, man. They're struggling. I've worked with them for 30 years. I know this population. And for a bunch of activists to set up a bunch of tents in a public park in a city and say, we're creating a safe place where you can spend the night and we're going to have free food, and you don't expect the homeless people just to show up and want to take advantage of that, independent of their skill or addictions or anything about them, of course they're going to show up. And of course they're going to want to use the free housing and the free food. That's their job. That's what they're doing. And they're going to bring all their baggage with them. And they're not going to magically become appropriately behaved just because they're at a GA. That's just the way it is. But you can't blame them.
Right.
You invite them.
Yeah, I go, well, what did you expect? You
Exactly.
know?
And so you have people who are obviously inebriated, almost falling down drunk, who are participating in GAs is just stupid. You can't do that. That's not fair to anybody, including the person who's falling down drunk. That's not fair to them either, because they're not empowered. They're not collected. They're not participating in a meaningful way. They're drunk. They're having fun. They're partying, if you want to be kind about it. You know, so that's just stupid. And I saw occupiers all over the country doing that. So one fundamental problem is you only let people who are in the group in the meeting. That's okay with me.
Yep.
That would take care of a lot of problems. But even within that, you still get people who will either episodically, occasionally have emotional outbursts or have issues with their personal life, and they bring that to the group. And while we can be sensitive and caring about what's going on with that individual, it's not really in the best interest of the group for them to dominate the group's energy because their mother died.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Or even they got raped. I mean, that's horrible. That's not what we're there for. That should happen outside the meeting, with support and nurturing and help with that member of our community. But in the meeting itself, we shouldn't devote the whole meeting to deal with that person's problem. That's not the purpose of the group, unless it is. It could be the purpose of the group, I guess, but it should be collectively decided, not unilaterally decided. So I saw a lot, and I still resent seeing all over the Occupy movement proposals to do things for individual people without any due diligence, without any holding them accountable, without having any knowledge of what they're actually even doing. Just that it looks good on papers, let's do it. And so that, without any group purpose. I mean, if we're struggling to change a system, we should be looking at systemic change. How do you make systemic change happen? And dealing with individual cases is not how you make systemic change happen. Sorry to say.
Yep.
It has to be done, but that's not the purpose of an activist group.
Right. That was the point I wanted to make. Is this is not saying that those people should be ignored. It's saying there's a different place and a different way that could be totally an Occupy activity, but to help that, because we're about helping people. But a GA or a working group is not necessarily the place to do that if we're going to be productive. Yeah. And I think that's fair to say. And
then there's one more piece.
Okay.
The last piece is that when anybody, doesn't matter, the stereotypic disruptor or alcoholic person or whatever, I'm not talking about anymore. I'm just talking about any group of people, any particular meeting. It does happen that people lose it or disrupt in some way or other. And what I teach, and this is a version of what we've had a theme running through all 3 nights, has been nonviolence, and my understanding of what's generally or loosely called Gandhian nonviolence, although like I said, I prefer Thoreauian nonviolence, is that when for the facilitator to deal with an individual who is doing something that is disruptive to the group process, whatever that looks like, to label that person a disruptor, to say what you're doing is disrupting, to approach the situation from that angle is a form of domination. It's a form of violence. Right. Because it's basically saying to that individual, you're not in this group. You're not doing the right thing. The rest is here all calm and mellow, and you're yelling, and that's just wrong, and you have to stop. That is actually not the approach you take. Even though that's actually true, that's not the approach you take in terms of dealing with the situation in human dynamics. The modeling, what the preferred model, what I would suggest or what I offer as an alternative is you say, as facilitator, I'm certain that you have something important to say. What you're trying to say is really important. I see that you care passionately about it. It's really important to you, and it might be very, very important to the group for us to hear what you have to say. But the way in which you are saying it right now, we cannot hear you because I can't hear you. I'm the facilitator. I know I can't hear you. But what you're doing right now, it's not helping you understand what it is you're trying to say. So can we help you participate in a way that we can actually understand what it is you're saying? And then there's a bunch of skills you can use, techniques you can do at that moment. There's the advocate role, yet another role that I actually developed. The only role I know that I developed. It's called the advocate role, and that's where somebody advocates for that person, actually takes up their cause. Even if they don't believe in it themselves personally, they act it. They take it up, and in the hopes that the group can hear what the gem of an idea is without all the rhetoric and emotion and craziness that might be generated by the person because they're triggered or something. So anyway, you see the spirit of that, of keeping them in the group, but asking them to change the way they're behaving.
Right. Excellent.
Rather than saying the way you're behaving puts you out of the group.
Because that's judgmental and violent in and of itself, which defeats the whole purpose. Right.
Right. So, and I've done this, and it's been, I've done this behavior as a peacekeeper, as a person at occupied GAs, numerous times across the country. I would approach people who were coming at the GA as disruptors, and I would intervene and neutralize them. And often the other activists there either thought I was doing the wrong thing. I actually got surrounded by the peacekeepers in Boston as if I was the disruptor, because there was only one of me and there was 20 disruptors. And I tried to deal with them, and they attacked me. The peacekeepers attacked me. So there's such a fundamental misunderstanding of that tactic of supporting the person who's standing up for the group but doing it in a way that doesn't conform to the group habit. You know, they're actually still in the group. You don't exclude them from the group just because you don't like the way they're behaving. You ask them to change their behavior by including them in the group.
There's a lot of learning that has to take place. I mean, I'm in listening, and I can see why, it seems like 14 hours isn't enough to be able.
There you go.
Because we have to break our conditioning, right? And that's a lot of what you're talking about. So I have one more question on my list, and then if you feel up to it, I'd love to take a few questions off of the chat because people are dying to ask questions. The part of my and I appreciate you speaking to our observations of Occupy. This question was based on the fact that I've watched numerous 3 and 4 hour GAs that accomplished absolutely nothing and just ended in disarray. Right. And so my question was, is the model a time and energy efficient decision making process for outcome? Because the observational experience is not so much, because I like to get things done, but as you describe it and looking at this, it seems reasonable because the work takes place in front of the implementation. So is it time and energy efficient for an outcome-based resolution? Like if I want to paint the house red, is the values-based consensus decision-making a time and energy-efficient methodology to get to that?
So the short answer is yes. The longer answer is that I've been teaching this. I wrote the first book 25 years ago. This is the 25th anniversary of the book. Okay, so I've been teaching this a long time, and for most of that time, probably close to 20 years, I didn't compete between other models of decision-making and the model I teach. I said they're equal. The function of how long a decision takes to make is not a function of the process being used if you're using the process that you're using well. I mean, they're different, but if you use the process well, it shouldn't get in the way of making the decision. But decisions themselves are sometimes easy and sometimes hard.
Right. And
that determines whether they take a short or long, how much time they take is how complex, controversial, and difficult they are, not what process you use. But if you use a process badly, then that adds even more time in. So one point to make, and this is an illusion that Ren came up with about GAs, was that it's like what the organizers do is they call a meeting in the park, and they say, instead of having a business meeting to make decisions, we're going to play Beethoven's violin concerto. And so they hand out violins to everybody in the crowd, and they hand out sheet music, and they say, okay, now let's play. Mm-hmm. And not very much happens.
Right. Well, a lot happens, but nothing gets done. It's a cacophony.
Okay, there you go. Right. And of course, now out of 100 people, there might be 2 or 3 who actually know how to play the violin. Right. So some people would actually be able to start playing. Right. And maybe even lucky, and because the way I suppose, maybe even virtuoso as one of those people. They could really soar. Right. But generally speaking, it's going to be a mess. Okay. And the use of consensus was like that. I actually had the literal experience traveling around Occupy of showing up at a facilitator's working group, and when I introduced myself, somebody recognizing who I was and the fact that they had read that they knew about my book. And they would say something, I mean, literally this happened, where somebody said, we base our consensus process on your book. And I said, but have you read the book? And they said, no. They hadn't actually read the book, or fully. They said, what they actually said, truthfully, was I read some of it. But, I don't know what that means exactly, and if it's likely, it means they read a couple of pages, or skimmed through it,
right,
like you referred to. So a lot of people around Occupy said they were using consensus. A lot of groups said they were using my book as consensus. I never saw it. It wasn't happening. So that didn't happen. So it's not really fair to compare what happened to what I'm teaching, because it doesn't look the same. And you can tell already by tonight that the things I've already said make it very, very different than what actually happened. What I teach now is that actually I believe that consensus is faster than voting. And there's an important reason why. That's conceptual. And then I'll get to the technical answer. The conceptual answer is that we don't make decisions in a vacuum. They're not an end in themselves, although some occupiers may have looked that way. Some GAs may have looked that way. Mm-hmm. We make decisions to then implement them, to get something done in the future. In other words, a meeting is a plan to do something in the future. You make decisions about the future. That's what it is. You're making plans or decisions about the future. If it's already happened, you don't have to make a decision about it. And some very rarely make decisions right in the moment that apply right to the moment. But mostly, it's something that's going to happen in the future. So if you use majority rule and you have 100 people in your group and 70 people really like it and 30 people really don't like it, when you go to implement it, those 30 people may not necessarily, like I said before, they'll sabotage, they'll resist, they'll undermine, they might not do a task that they were given to do. And then also the other 70 people, maybe only 30 of them are really zealots about it. The other 30 are like, well, maybe I'll feel, I only voted for this because I wanted to get my vote for this other thing that I wanted. You know what I'm talking about? Mm-hmm, so you don't have this commitment to actually doing it. You have a uneven commitment to actually doing the decision once the decision is made. And since I work a lot with nonprofit boards of directors, I hear all the time the comment that they make a decision in a board meeting, sometimes after a lot of discussion and after maybe 2 or 3 meetings, they finally make a decision, only to have discussion in the parking lot that night as they're leaving, undermining and talking about how bad the decision was. And that's very frustrating. And they talk about how they make decisions, and then 6 months later they find they're making the same decision again because it didn't get implemented. That happens in boards all the time.
Right.
They make decisions, they don't get implemented. So that's a part of decision making. If you make a decision and it doesn't get implemented in a timely fashion, you have to make it again or re-support it, that's part of the decision making process.
Right.
That's the time it takes to get it done. In consensus, the concept is if you've really got buy-in, if everybody's truly signed off, said I've at least given my consent, if not my wholehearted support, and everybody's really done that, and they've really been heard, and their concerns have really been addressed, and the group has really worked hard to address their concerns, they're going to implement that decision. And everybody's going to implement that decision. And so what happens next is implementation. For real. It really happens.
And it's smooth and clean because everybody has the buy-in already.
Exactly. And that really does happen. That's
yes.
not just my fantasy. I've seen it. And that's more efficient. It's better decision-making in the first place, saves you time. That's the conceptual one. The technical part is that in the like I said, decision making starts with an idea. Somebody has an idea, wants to do something, and wants a group to do it, so they bring it to the group. So it starts with an idea, and it ends with it actually happening, or some version of it happening. In dictatorships, the dictator or one of the ministers has an idea. The dictator hears it. Okay, let's do it. So it makes the decision right up front. But then they've got to get the army out to get everybody to actually do the damn decision because nobody wants to do it, right?
Right.
So that takes a long time to implement, even though the decision was made the hour after they heard the idea. Then you have a board of directors or an oligarchy or a Congress, like the U.S. Congress, and it takes them a little bit longer to make the decision because a group of people have to get there and talk about it, but then they still have to impose it upon a whole lot of other people and get them to do it. So it takes a little bit longer to actually make the decision, but then it still takes a long time to implement it. In consensus, yeah, it takes longer to actually make the decision, but once you make the decision, it gets implemented.
Mm-hmm.
So from idea to implementation is a function of the complexity and difficultness of the decision to do and what it's about, not at what point the decision was made by whom. That shouldn't be in the way. That's not a function of time. So the whole idea that consensus takes longer, I dispute.
Consensus, if used properly, is efficient.
Well, definitely. Yeah. And I'm not personally wedded to the word consensus. That's why I add value-based to my model.
Okay.
Because it's a really new, and people are beginning to encourage me to say, this is a really new paradigm of decision making. It's a whole other way of being. It's not just like voting, only different. It's not like voting at all.
Right.
It's a whole other system.
Thank you for all that, the whole evening. I want to make one observation. The feeling I get from this is that the model is dependent on the honesty and goodwill of the people participating, which is something you touched on the other night about, just being open and honest. So the group coalesces, everybody has to be open and honest with no hidden agendas. Then this model will serve that group so consensus or decisions can be made that everybody can feel, comfortable with and implemented without obstructions. Yes? Okay,
yes.
Great. So again, it comes back to depending on the good inside of people that we all know and hope is there.
Well, so I depends on. If you mean that it has to be there or for it to actually happen, I don't agree with that. The structure itself has it in it. The structure actually has values embedded in it. So if you actually use the structure produces that outcome, not individuals.
Got it. Okay. Good
so,
point.
Yes,
Good point.
Individuals. Well, it's important because I do get what you're saying. If you expect that it creates saints, if every individual has to be a saint in order to use this process, then it would break down because people are not saints all the time. Even saints are not saints all the time.
Right.
So that's not the point. The point is the structure itself has those values in it. And the group is conversant in those values. So they actually notice when an individual or a behavior or an idea is outside their value system. They don't necessarily have to stop it. They don't have to dislike it, but they notice. Right now, most people don't notice when somebody is acting in a way that is competitive when the group has said, let's try to be cooperative here. So in my model, the group says, let's try to be cooperative here, and somebody starts acting in a competitive way, the group says, no, stop. We're not doing that here. If you want to do that, form your own group. And you can be competitive in your own group. But in this group, we're cooperative. But the only way that's going to happen by process is if the whole group knows it. Not every person exactly the same. And anytime, I even get passionate. In a meeting group that I belong to, that I care about, I lose it. I'm very skilled at process, but I can get passionate and get my buttons pushed and say things I regret later. So the process doesn't have buttons. The process doesn't lose it. Excellent. We forget to honor it. We don't follow it. So it depends upon the process. The process does depend upon people behaving with goodwill and honesty. But the process also doesn't work if you don't behave that way.
Got it. So the process serves as our grounding element and touchstone and map. So
Instead of leaders,
right,
instead of having a dictator or a leader or a charismatic person getting us, cajoling us to do the right thing, the process gets us to do that.
wonderful. Thank you for that. And now we're going to take a few questions. And
Great.
if I don't care that we're going long tonight. This is awesome. I love it. So the first question, and Locke, if I don't get the idea of this, chime in and I'll do it. Um, does it does the values-based consensus model allow for multiple groups that are working on separate issues with the same goal? Like, so if we have this like big project and we're breaking it
Yeah.
down into elements, each group works on an element. Are they able to integrate even though they may not agree with specific issues across the group? Did that make
I will turn that
sense?
question. Yeah, now I follow the question,
Okay.
and I'm going to turn the question on its head. I'm going to say not only does the model allow that, the model expects that it purposely does break larger groups up into smaller groups, so there's that flexibility. That's the affinity group model, where
Okay.
you have groups of 10 to 15 people who are an affinity group who are autonomous. They can have their own internal values and purpose and mission that has nothing to do with anybody else in the city. But they also want to work on community gardens. They also want to work to stop injustice. So they form coalitions with other affinity groups, and the purpose of the coalition called Occupy is challenging economic injustice and creating economic justice. So that affinity group joins that coalition when they want to do that work, and they join the community garden coalition when they want to work on the community garden, and that everybody does that. That's the design of the whole model. In fact, that's not so. Therefore, it not just doesn't allow it. That's actually the model.
Excellent. Okay. And a person said even though I fumbled it, I got the question out good. So thank you for the answer. So I'm waiting for questions out of the chat. Have we got chat lag? Is that what the problem is? Questions.
Oh no, not chat lag.
Yeah, it happens, right? And we were, just so you know, we were broadcast on Global Revolution. The whole interview has been out on Global Revolution, which is the big mothership live stream channel. So
Nice.
people all over the world see that one. So we have one question.
Uh-oh.
What could or should a, a GA do when there is a clear provocateur in the group?
Stop.
Stop the process and
Stop everything.
and
And reconvene at another time and not allow that person in.
shut the meeting down and reconvene later.
Right.
The
Now
door,
that's the most extreme. That's the most extreme answer to a most extreme question.
yeah,
Okay. That's assuming that a whole lot of other things have already happened that failed and didn't work.
right,
I've in a process that's actually working, that would never happen.
right. Because
So the
you'd have
question,
all the checks and balances in the doorkeeper
yeah,
and all that stuff.
all that stuff.
Yeah,
Right. So all that stuff are operating, but it still can happen. It's not like I'm saying it never happens,
right,
but the kind of thing that Occupy saw was a flaw in the overall structure, not something that happens in consensus.
right.
It wasn't a problem of consensus. It was a problem of flawed structure that Occupy had embraced. Sorry, it just was. I mean, it just that whole idea of inclusion was completely on its head. It was backwards. So they were including people who were iconoclasts and dictators in a group that was supposed to be horizontal and egalitarian.
Right.
That doesn't make sense.
And
Dictators like to dictate.
that's true. And disruptors like to disrupt. It's in their nature.
Exactly. So if you invite them, that's what they're going to do.
Right. Because again, what did you expect? So
So
in an instance like that, that's a group decision. Like the group again decides, okay, we're closing this meeting down. We'll reconvene at a different time.
right. That's the nonviolent response. That's the nonviolent solution to when somebody just will absolutely not listen to anybody.
Right.
They're just going off They're not listening to anybody in the room. They're not going to stop. And rather than attack them and beat them up, the group just says, okay, we're done. We'll leave out of here. And then you're just banned from any future meeting. You don't get to come in again. And we'll, do everything we can to keep you out, not let you in.
Right.
And you can't really do that either without, eventually. I mean, there was a funny incident in Philadelphia during the shouting GA. All the GAs were shouting GAs.
I was going to say, yeah, which one?
Yeah. Was that one of the people shouting in the back of the room? I heard the story afterwards. I was up in the front of the room. I was up at work, supporting the facilitators. But one of the people in the back of the room that was shouting was approached by one of my students who was doorkeeping informally. There was no official doorkeeper, but they knew that was a role, and they were just doing it, just spontaneously. And so she went over, as I taught, to deal with this person who was disrupting ad hominem attacks at the facilitator, right? Not appropriate. So she went over to deal with the person, and the person and this other older man came with her, sort of back her up, and just was sort of standing there. And the woman who was disrupting, who was an activist, it wasn't a drunk person, it was an activist. And the man behind her said, well, as a matter of fact, I could. I'm the owner of the space. I'm the guy managing the space. I'm the guy who controls the space. I could actually call the police and have you removed. Oh, well, I didn't tell it very well, but it was really, really funny because she thought she was being really free, right?
Right.
And standing up for her rights. And the guy asked, well, no, actually, I am the guy that can throw you out.
Yeah. Our Skype network seems to be having a little bit of problems. So, but
Okay.
All right, are we back on OPN? Yeah, can we revisit the story you just told about the lady, because some people missed it because it was freezing. So the lady in the shouting thing and the building owner and blah blah blah. Could you do that again?
It was just a coincidence, but it was like the activist woman who was disrupting was in the back of the room. One of my students who was acting as doorkeeper, who was an activist, went over to her to try to calm her down or address her concerns or do whatever, just try to distract her, because that's one of the tactics. Just go over and talk to them and find out what their issues are. Be friendly and be supportive and say, what are you trying to do? But she was trying to do that, but the person was combative. They didn't want any part of that. So as the doorkeeper was trying to understand what was going on, the person started shouting, you can't throw me out. You can't stop me. You can't throw me out. And this man standing directly behind her who was involved said, well, actually, I can throw you out because I'm the manager of the building.
Which is a great story. And I actually had a teacher once. It was the whole premise of the class was limits and boundaries. It was a clay class. And that everybody was like offended. Oh, like we have to be able to express ourselves. She just said, no, limits and boundaries give you something to help you find your way. It also gives you something to push against. So they're not bad in and of themselves. They're not restrictive. They're only restrictive but we need limits and boundaries in order to operate in a reasonable manner sometime. So
it's not the boundaries or the rules, it's who makes them that's important. When somebody else makes them and makes you have to live by them, that's a problem. When you get to cooperate in making them, they're helpful.
Right. Imposed boundaries are not so great, but collective and mutually agreed upon boundaries are. So the chat is paused. I'm looking back to see if there's any more. I'm sure there was.
You started asking a question when we froze up. I didn't hear any of it. You said when, and that's all I heard. But you said it was from OWS.
Oh yeah. So the question was from somebody in OWS, said that they had seen you, and I guess you did some work with the Long Island group. And so the question is, how do you see the future of the GA being revived, and is that possible in NYC?
Well, that's a very timely question because although I'm no longer physically in New York City, although I was for 3 months, the last 3 months, I just got to Washington, D.C. this past week, I had very little success reaching out to the formal process, if you will, or I don't know how to describe it, but the people who are doing OWS still.
Yeah. And
I
this was
was
in the
working with,
city, correct? In
right.
Yeah.
I was living on Staten Island, so I was more contact with and was more involved with the Staten Island GA, which is a much smaller group and a much friendlier group, if you will. So, but even them, I didn't work with much.
Hmm.
So, up until, let's see, this is Thursday, so 2 weeks ago, 2 Fridays ago, I was invited by a small group that's working on reviving the GA in Zuccotti Park, or at least the GA that was occupied. They want to revive it. And they invited me to come speak and talk about my ideas, and I did do that, and it was very, very exciting. There were certainly some people who were very oppositional. They were not interested. It's not universal by any means, and I wouldn't assume that would be the case. But there were quite a few people who were quite impressed along the same lines of tonight about the points that I'm making, about the model that I teach. So they've committed themselves to studying and learning value-based consensus to see if it is an alternative and could create the kind of democratic process that the whole movement wanted when they claimed they were having GAs that were direct democracy, and it turned out that direct democracy was a lot harder than people thought it was going to be. So that's really it's exciting, but so far it's only been a statement. No
Right.
one's that nothing, because it takes a while to learn this. You don't learn it in one lesson.
Right. What do you think the nature to the resistance of the idea is? I find that interesting. If you were asked to speak and there were some people that were supportive, but some people were resistant, were they resistant to the idea, the concept? Were they resistant to the model? Were they resistant to you personally? I mean, what's the nature, or is it just people being people?
Well, clearly, you'd have to ask those people. I can't speak for them.
Good point. Yeah.
But I would say that at least a significant amount of the time, the tactic that disruptors like that use is ad hominem attacks more than, let's say, logical or adroit or philosophical challenges to the actual principles and ideas that I'm teaching. So I'm saying that it's not so much they say, that idea of asking a negative question, that really doesn't work. It would be much better to ask a positive question, because then we keep in a positive frame, something like that. Something like that.
Right. Right.
That would be a cogent argument of an alternate way of doing it, and I'd be open to that. It happens to be that John Buck, who teaches sociocracy, is a really good friend of mine. I was just with him this morning. We do salons together because I love picking his brain. He loves picking my brain. We have very different ideas about how groups should operate, but we respect each other, and we like how we think. So we can talk about different ideas and be different, but still talk about them in not even argumentative ways, in exploratory ways. What do you really mean by that? Do you really mean that? How does that work exactly? I don't understand. I think it's supposed to, that's what we do, right?
Mm-hmm.
But these people are saying, and even it happened 2 nights ago here, right? One of the chat people said, that guy is lying, or something to that effect.
Right.
Well, my question was, well, who is that person and how do they know? Were they there? I was talking about something that happened 30 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm worried that the person saying that was 28 years old.
Yeah. Good. Good point.
So they know it didn't happen.
Yep. So there's hope for NYC, and we'll remain cautiously optimistic.
Yes. Well, I wasn't fully fair. Really, what happened was that the feminist GA. I don't know if you know much about the feminist GA in New York City, but like I said, I believe that they were supposed to meet last night, but maybe it was Monday. But it was this week sometime. Maybe it's next week. I'm sorry. Maybe I've got the wrong week. Maybe it's next Wednesday. It's the 18th, I think. Is that next Wednesday?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Yes, maybe that's it. It's next Wednesday. So the feminist GA, that'll be the third feminist GA, and they are making sincere efforts to learn and use value-based consensus as well. But they only meet once a month,
Right.
as a GA.
So, but the effort is being made, and so maybe it will take root. All we need is a couple of good examples, and we're good to go.
Yeah. Right.
have a person asking where and how do you organize your classes on consensus decision making?
I do them. I travel, so I'm a consultant. I usually come in for, especially when it's a group that exists already that wants to learn this. They hire me. They call me up and we make a contract, and I go in and teach them on site. I occasionally, and what I was doing through Occupy was traveling around doing spontaneous workshops and just having whoever showed up attend. But I'm not doing that anymore. It ended. The backing, the third-party financing for that dried up.
Okay, so it's kind of at request, wherever, based on conditions.
Yes, right.
Okay. Somebody asked, what was it that compelled you to write the book, the first edition of the book?
Well, that was, if you were there the first night, we were talking about the Pledge of Resistance. And I was in a leadership role in the Pledge of Resistance in Boston. It was a very large organization for an activist group. We had something in Boston, I believe we had over 2,000 people sign the pledge, which was committing themselves to doing nonviolent direct action or getting arrested if the government attacked, invaded. And then eventually if they funded Contra aid. And we did do that. We got one of our major protests, we had 528 people arrested in one protest in Boston. And I was one of those people. I was also a time when I got beaten unconscious or brutalized. I was on the coordinating council or the coordinating committee. We met once a week, and we had a spokes council of the approximately 200 affinity groups that we had once a month that made the actual decisions. And the coordinating council was a working group that implemented the decisions that the spokes council was making. And we were using a fairly refined, evolved version of consensus. Much of what I didn't invent that's in my book came from that era. That's what we were doing, was this version of consensus that's in my book, without the value-based part and without the three steps, the three levels, the flow chart. But,
right.
But generally, the rest of it was what we were doing. And we were pretty good at it. But we were having people join by every week, a couple of dozen people would join and form new affinity groups and such. And they didn't know how to use consensus. As at the very beginning of this live stream, a couple hours ago, you said you talked to some people today and they said, consensus, oh, what's that? Mm-hmm. So you can imagine if we're having people join and they're showing up and they're going, consensus, what's that? And I went to the coordinating council and I said, this is not democratic. Using consensus like this is not democratic because we have people who don't even know how to do it. How can we say we're democratic when they can't even participate because they don't know the rules? And they're not. They were sidelined because they didn't know what was going on. It wasn't Robert's rules. It wasn't majority rule voting, which they knew. It was something else. So I said, obviously, what we need to do is we need to be teaching people consensus as part of our membership process. We have to teach them nonviolence. We also have to teach them consensus. We have to do that. It's an obligation. So as anybody who's been a part of an activist voluntary group, you know that the next answer was, great idea, CT. You do it.
Yeah,
right?
How about it? You're empowered.
Yeah. So I thought it'd be easy. I was fool. And I'd never written a book. I couldn't even put a sentence together. I didn't do very good in English in high school and college, so I was really challenged. And it took me a year and a half to write the first draft of the first book. And by the time I finished writing it, the group that I started writing it for, the Pledge of Resistance, had pretty much gone by. It was still around, but it was much, much smaller. Mm-hmm. We had been successful in preventing the invasion. But other groups, in particular the dance community that I'm a part of, Dance New England, which is on the Etherpad, they adopted this model. They adopted my book, and I started teaching workshops for them. Mm-hmm. So basically, I wrote the book so that people could have access to this information. And another footnote, just so people understand my ego and what's about for me, the first book, when I first wrote it, I wouldn't put my name on the cover because I felt I hadn't done anything special. All I had done is written down what I learned from these great activists that I was so honored to work with. But when I started teaching it, those very same activists who I had learned this from said to me, this book that you've written isn't exactly what we do. You've modified it. You've changed it. Some of them said, you broke it. You've made it less than. So you need to put your name on it and call it your model of consensus because you're not doing what we do. Mm-hmm. And I struggled with that because I didn't want to put my name on it. I didn't think it was anything special. But I came to realize that I did invent two new things, big things, two big new things. And that was the flow chart, that separation, the no crosstalk,
Right.
that whole structure, and the idea that blocks are decided by the group, not by the individual. The individuals will hold their consent, and the group decides whether they're blocked or not. That concept was my concept. I introduced that. That's the only two things that were wholesale new in my book. Everything else was regurgitated from what I learned from other people. But that was enough to get people to say, this is too different than what we do. You have to call it your own model. So I eventually did. And my first name for it was secular consensus, to distinguish it from the Quaker model, which was spiritual consensus, which is very different. But that didn't work so well because people thought that it meant that you couldn't be a spiritual group and use it. And I wasn't meaning that. So then for a long time I called it formal consensus because my big gift was that structure. And I was pointing to form. But unfortunately nowadays, especially within government circles, they make this cliche they didn't reach a formal consensus on blowing up the world. You know, and what they mean was they didn't reach unanimous agreement. And that's not what I'm talking about at all. So in the last 2 years, with the help of Ren, who brought this forward, that we've realized that the value base is the most important part of the model that I bring, this new culture, this new understanding. And that's so fundamentally different that that's why we call it value-based consensus now.
Right.
So I wrote the book to teach.
To share information, info sharing. Yeah.
Which I think is one of the cornerstones of egalitarianism.
And just nobody has asked this, but it's are the books still in print, or do we need? Okay, so
they're self-published.
Right. Oh, okay.
So you have to buy them from me.
Consensus.net.
Yep.
Okay, so anybody that's interested.
The Consensus for Cities is not. It's a funny thing. I never really finished it. I wrote it in 2009. Partly because I was suffering from a PTSD, and I didn't have a diagnosis, and I didn't know that, and I was really scared because my life I was getting in ill health. So a friend of mine offered me a deal. He said, "You come and live in my house. I'll let you live here, and I'll feed you for a year if you write down the second book, this other book." Because I've been thinking about it, talking about it for years.
Right.
And since it looked like I might be dying, I thought I better write that book. So I wrote it all down. And I put it in book form so that my students and people could see what I was thinking about, but I called it a proof edition because I never edited it. I never finished it.
Right.
I just got the first draft done. And then my life happened and I never went back to it, but now I'm selling copies of this manuscript, this unedited book, which feels awkward, but they are available. There's no advertising for it. On the website there's nothing about it because it's not finished yet.
Yeah. So just contact you through the website and
or my email address.
Yeah. Okay. So my next question, we actually have a viewer from Scotland watching this, and it's really late over there, or early, depending on your point of view.
Yeah, 4 o'clock or something.
And Locke, I'll try to get this right. With I'm guessing you mean with the communications available, do you feel it is important to keep the consensus to process to local issues and discussions, or can groups be worldwide using the technology? I bet is where he's going with that, or she.
Right. Well, certainly anything's possible. So, with the right adaptations, with the right understandings, I think that you can do anything. Indie Media, the network that's known as Indie Media, started, and the original founding members and the original Indie Media nodes and all that were all based upon formal consensus, was what it was called then. They even had it on their website. It got taken down because people later joined who didn't understand and got all huffy. And that resistance part, that messes me up. And now it's a mess, actually. But in their early days, and they never had face-to-face meetings, and they were all over the world.
Okay.
And that's all they were. And they operated using this model. So obviously it can be done.
So Zena, if you're still with us, you need to roll that into Mumble because we could use that there. The next question is somebody who says they have studied Jack Reed's book, The Next Evolution, which I'm not familiar with, and he suggests that we should split into groups of 10, achieve consensus in those groups, and then send representatives from those groups to other groups to perpetuate the consensus.
Yeah.
Is that a good way to do consensus and for really large groups?
That is what my model. That's what my new book is all about. So, and I don't know. I mean, and so I don't know when he wrote that book. This model that I finally wrote in 2009, I originally wrote for the U.S. Greens. No, for the Greens before it became the Green Party in 1990. So I've been working, and it's the model we used in the Pledge of Resistance in 1985. So it's not a new idea by any stretch, that concept. But I certainly need to know what was meant by representatives. Because if they mean in the U.S. form of like U.S. representatives and the Congress, the House of Representatives, that form of representatives, doesn't work. Not a good idea. Mm-hmm. If it's a spokes council and those are spokespeople, I could buy into it. I could accept it. So I don't know what that person's meaning by that, but that connection is crucial.
Right.
And there is another model now out in the world. In Europe, it's called sociocracy. In the United States, it's called dynamic governance. And they address that issue with this concept called double linking. Very, very important to their model as well. It's got to have something in there, that connection between the various circles, the various levels, wherever it's structured. That link is how it's shaped. What that looks like is how, whether that works or not, or whether I accept it or not as a model. Right. Personally. So without knowing what that means, so representatives, if they mean like actually the way the U.S. uses it,
right,
I would not support that model. It would not work.
He or she, I'm not sure the gender. He's saying, as in your group of 10, when you reach consensus, then you send a delegate from your group to the other groups.
Yep.
So that kind of works.
Right. But that person does not have any special powers.
They're just communicating.
And their whole, yeah, and you can get sophisticated with it. The affinity group could send them with parameters. Could say, okay, we're the bicycle guild of the local village, and that's our affinity group. But the village wants to buy a fire truck for obvious reasons, and so we would rather it be a human-propelled vehicle, but we kind of understand for right now probably having a gas-propelled vehicle is what people want because it's faster, blah, whatever. So we're going to consent to, we don't like the idea it's going to be a gas-powered engine, but we'll consent to it because we understand the need for a fire truck, but we don't want them to go whole hog and buy the Cadillac of fire trucks. We want them to get the Prius version of fire trucks.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
Yep.
So they could send them with a parameter saying you can spend this much money between $50,000 and $70,000, but you can't spend $100,000.
Okay, good. And they're saying
the representative, the spokesperson can go to the next meeting, and if it falls within the parameters, they can consent to it because they've already been empowered to do that. If it falls outside the parameters, they have to say, I can't consent to it because my group is not consented to it.
Right. Okay, so you effectively answered that question. Thank you, V, for your patience and for tolerating my mangling of it. Do we have any more questions from the chat? We have a good many viewers, and we're getting broadcast mirrored on several other channels, but we can only take the questions through our chat. So I want to give everybody a chance to chime in if necessary. And so while we're waiting for that, if you have any closing thoughts, we'd love to hear them. Thank you for being our first series. It was everything I hoped for and much more, and I appreciate your effort and your passion and your patience with us and just your willingness to be here and tell us just what's going on with you. And this was such a good way to wrap it up, this values-based consensus decision making. I won't sleep tonight because I'm so excited. So if you have any closing thoughts, I'm going to wait for a couple more questions and then we'll call it a night.
Well, I'm going to do this only because it's right there pushing me. It's the environment I live in doing this work because it doesn't pay. I've been a peace activist my whole adult life. I've lived on the edge financially. I've always been proud of the fact that I have voluntary poverty, that I don't I don't take advantage of my white privilege and the background, my class privilege that I was born into. I lost a long time ago, and now it's really gone. I can't reclaim it. It's gone. I've from certain people in my family, I've screwed myself. I've done a really bad thing with my life. But from my perspective, I'm really proud of it. But the reality is that, with all this wonderful possibilities with Occupy and what's happening there, the movement's about economic justice. And I've had to begun saying to people, look, in the last month, I actually ran out of money, so I had to borrow money to eat. I don't have enough money to even eat these days. And here I am doing this great work. I'm traveling. I'm teaching people. I'm doing these interviews. I'm doing this stuff. And I'm starving. And, I know it's romantic, and I know it's the starving artist kind of, or starving activist, but I'm also approaching 60. And it's getting hard. And if we're about economic justice, it doesn't seem to me that this is economically just, that I do this work so passionately and so committedly and am starving because of it. And I know it's nobody's individual's fault, and it's my own fault if you want to come from the old paradigm. I invited this. I created this. But in the new paradigm, things should be different. So I'm waiting for that day to happen, and I hope that I don't starve to death before it does. And I'm not gonna. I'm very creative. I'm very talented. But what it means is that I have to pull myself away from doing this vital work, which I think is essential and imperative, to do things like paint somebody's porch so I can get paid $200, or go to a job. I'm looking for a job with some, an unrelated field. But I use my skills, but not to this end.
Right.
So I understand the people who think I don't know what I'm talking about. They're not going to support me. But the people who like the ideas I have, they've got to figure out a way to translate that into something that helps me survive, because it's not working so far.
Right. It's the same issue we have with streamers and all that. It's everybody's contributing time and energy, but we live in a capitalist society that has overhead by definition. It's the rules of the game that we are in. And yes, we can change those rules, but right now you got to eat. And it's a cash economy, and there's no getting away from that. So I'm glad you brought that up, because I don't think we talk about that enough. A couple of quick questions. One, somebody wants to know if you're coming back to New York City anytime soon.
Well, that relates directly to what we were just talking about. The deal is that as soon as they come up with the money to afford me, to bring me back, I'll come back. But I can't come back without I can't get there right now.
Right.
I can't do it. And I had to leave because I couldn't afford to stay there.
Right.
I had to go where the money is. That's what I had to do. I left 3 days after I made the speech in Zuccotti Park on Friday night, where people were like, well, let's do this. And I left.
Right.
Because there's no money.
Because you had no choice.
So as soon as they have a working group that's working on that. I don't know what progress they've made, but they're trying to raise money so that they can bring me back. So yeah, I'll come back as soon as they can raise the money to do that.
Great point and fair point, because this is it. I touch on this myself a lot, that I live in an artist community, and everybody has the same problem. Everybody's got art out the wazoo. Nobody has money, and there's bills to pay. And it's like, okay, figure out the new economy, because this is just killing everybody. That was just a little aside. So, I say it all the time: support the streamer, support the guest. CT's here. Go to his website. Support CT however you can. How's that? I'll throw it out there.
It's not no one person. It's not a blame thing. It's the transitional dynamic we're caught in.
It's the way it is. And if I like to say, as in my artwork, I try to help out as much as I can, either but I say you cannot expect to be supported unless you're willing to be supportive. That's a two-way street. So what that's worth. A question: how do we help young activists that think they can do whatever they want to learn how to stop being so disruptive? How can we help educate them? My answer to that would be history and context.
And my answer is that you don't teach. You can't. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. you don't teach somebody who doesn't want to learn. The way I say that is that Occupy is not, in my experience up to now, been a student movement. And I don't mean college students. I mean a movement willing to learn.
Right.
That's not their ethic. That was the way I was when I was a young activist. I was a sponge. I wanted to learn everything I could. I was reading all kinds of historical documents about anarchy, living my life. We talked about that. So we've already talked about that in previous broadcasts. So, studying that is really important. But what I would say is that you don't. That they have to figure out for themselves that they want to learn this stuff. And until they figure that out, they're not gonna. So there's no point in even trying to engage them. The thing to do is to create a model that works so well that they're attracted to it and come willingly because they want to learn.
That's it.
So the goal is the shorthand for that is that we have a vision of how we want to be in the world. We recircle the wagons. We don't use what currently is happening because it's not working. We do it differently, and we make it so appealing and successful and dynamic that the people who right now say, oh, that takes too long, or, oh, that's not doing stuff, that's having meetings, and, oh, that's structure and rules. But when we're doing it and we're being successful, they go, wow, those guys over there, they're really doing a lot. What makes them so successful? And they find out it's because we have a solid process and solid structure and a clear definition of group. Then they go, oh, I get it, and then they join.
Because we set a good example.
Right.
And people like to be part of something that works.
Definitely.
So that's it. And the last question tonight, and this is it's actually, for some reason, it strikes me as funny, but it's actually a real poignant question. When you just emerge from the Matrix and you feel like you're James Dean, what next?
Oh, man. I have a life of that. I've been there my life, right? Well, I'd say that I feel like I'm an alien. I feel like I don't belong on this planet. I'm from somewhere else. So what's next is you find other people like you. You put up signs. You post things on the internet. You find people who are like you. That requires two activities. One is figure out who you are. Who you are. What are your values? What matters most to you, both in terms of meta words like honesty and transparency, egalitarian, those kind of words, nonviolence, those kind of meta words, but also what matters to you, what motivates you, what goals in life, there's a lot of goals. There's a lot of dire, from a leftist perspective, there's the economic crisis, there's the environmental crisis, there's the nuclear war crisis, there's, we go on and on. There's these crises, but which one of them really moves you? Or maybe it's two or three. It's up to you. Who are you? So first thing is figure out who you are and what motivates you and what you're about, and then hang out your shingle. Put out your what you stand for and find a handful, a dozen other people who can say, yeah, those values really matter to me too. And doing that purpose or those set of purposes really matters to me too. And start just doing stuff with them. It includes, in my mind, doing stuff means first you have a meeting to plan to do something, then you do it, you actually do it, and then you have a meeting to evaluate how it went, so you learn from your mistakes, and then you plan to do it again, better. And then you do it, and then you have another meeting, so you do it, you have a meeting, then you do it, then you have a meeting, then you do it, then you have a meeting, then you do it. It's like breathing. It's back and forth. It's not all meetings, and it's not all doing. It's you do both, because meetings help you plan, and they help you hold accountable and evaluate and improve. Doing helps you actually get the job done of whatever your larger purpose is. And if you find a small group of people and you start having meetings with them and you start doing things with them, that to me is the same thing. Having meetings with them, the reason why you're having meetings is to get something done, and then you do it, and then you have meetings to evaluate, and then you do something else. You do another thing. Start doing that with people and grow in that dynamic. First, maybe you just start doing activity once a week or something. But then my suggestion is grow into doing it as a life. Not just something you do on the side, but the goal is it's the same way I teach vegetarianism. When I meet somebody who's not currently a vegetarian but wants to become a vegetarian, and what they usually say is, I'm trying to stop eating meat. I'm trying to stop eating. First, I'm not eating, red meat, and next I'm going to stop eating white meat, and then I'm going to stop eating dairy. They have that kind of strategy. And I say to them, you do that, you're going to fail. You'll end up eating meat a year from now. You're not going to make it. It doesn't work. That's not how you become a vegetarian. The way you become a vegetarian is you find out what you want to eat. You find out how to cook and eat the foods you want to eat, like beans and rice and tofu and tempeh and all the things that are not meat. You discover what they are, you learn about them, and you start including them in your diet, so you're eating them. And then one day you go, wow, I can't remember the last time I had meat. Because you're eating all the things you want to eat.
Right.
And that's positive. That you will actually do. Because that's what you want to do, is eat the things you want to eat. But if you approach vegetarianism as what you can't do, that's negative, and you get into a blame shame cycle, and you end up being passive aggressive to yourself, and you end up failing. So in the same vein is that when you form an affinity group, the long range goal is that you want to start doing things you want to do, and you want them to continue to grow until that's what you're actually doing, and you're no longer participating in the overculture matrix at all. You're totally outside the system because you have a community of people to support you and them doing this other thing. And that's the progression. So first the individual gets outside, breaks out of the mold, becomes aware, they find other people like them, they form groups, and they start doing actions together until they're able to free themselves from the oppression of the other overculture.
Excellent.
And that's what I've been doing all my life.
An outstanding way to wrap up the week. I want to thank you so much. It's been a real honor and a privilege, and I just have so much in my head. It's like this week has opened my eyes to a lot of things, and given me a lot to think about. I've already started, just over the conversations of the last couple of days, I've started. I can hear your voice in my head, and I'm like doing this thing and doing that thing. So you have reached your one person at the very least. And yeah, bring Ren up so she can say hi to everybody. There's a dog. They got the whole family here. Thank you, Ren. It was wonderful to have you again, and for being part of this. It's been a great week for us. We really appreciate all your work and all your effort and all your input. We will have the whole series archived. We'll send you guys the links so you can share them anywhere you want to. For the chatters and the viewers on the screen, we will have these archived and on our YouTube channel and all that. We'll make sure you guys know about it. I want to thank the OPN production team for all their hard work. Suze for facilitating tonight, super good. And for all the new people that were here with us tonight, welcome, and we hope you come back and join us again. I think CT has set a standard we all gotta work to live up to. So thank you very much.